This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi, everybody. It's Briana Whitney, host of the True Crime Arizona podcast.
And I'm Morgan Loew, investigative reporter here at AZ Family.
We know you haven't heard from us for a little while now on a zombie hunter trial update. The reason for that is because it's been kind of all over the place with breaks. So they haven't even been meeting in the courtroom since mid-December. And even before that, there were some days that they were in the courtroom, other days they weren't. And so we kind of had to take a break as well. But we want to get everybody back up to speed with where the trial stands right now.
Yeah, and we'll talk about what's coming up in the trial a little bit later in this episode.
So we want to start out with some of the last testimony that people had before they broke before Christmas. And I guess just to also familiarize people, if you're just tuning in for the first time, Bryan Patrick Miller, he is on trial right now for the canal murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis in Phoenix in 1992 and 1993. And his team is going for a not guilty by reason of insanity defense. But of course, the prosecution says he did this. He should be convicted of capital murder for these two girls. So that's kind of where we stand on that.
Death penalty case, and a little odd because it is a bench trial. There's no jury. It's just a judge, which is part of the reason why they're okay with sort of a half day of testimony here and a couple of weeks off there. They don't have a group of jurors whose lives are being completely disrupted. It's just the judge, the attorneys, and the witnesses coming in to testify. So it's a very rare way to try a capital case, but this is what's happening here.
So let's start with you, Morgan. You actually got to talk to somebody who testified. And this is a pretty important player in Bryan Miller's life.
Yeah, so his name is Gerald Schrock, and he was a member of the Mennonite Church. And when Bryan Miller was a teenager, we know he was arrested for attacking a woman in a mall parking lot, and he was sent to juvenile detention. When he turned 18, he was released. And the Mennonites had a program where they identified and helped some of these troubled youth to try to get them back on track. And Gerald was tasked with taking care of Bryan Miller. And he described Bryan at the time of being this sort of 18-year-old who was much younger mentally and emotionally. He said we had to, tell him things like, this is why you had to take a shower every day. This is why you need a job so you can buy things. And Gerald really took Bryan under his wing. Gerald was a couple of years older than Bryan, a lot more mature. They lived in the same house. And Gerald told me that he sort of viewed Bryan as a son sometimes, as a brother sometimes, and as a friend at other times. And at the end of their time together, he viewed Bryan as someone who was closer to him than a brother. So they really got this connection. So he flies in to testify for the defense. And the first thing that I sort of took away from talking to him was this sense of guilt that Gerald feels to this day. And I asked him about that, and he said he felt guilty because he thinks that if he had not left Phoenix, maybe those two women would still be alive. Maybe he could have prevented Bryan from committing those murders if, in fact, Bryan did commit those murders.
How much time was there between Gerald leaving and the first murder, Angela Brasso, happening?
Yeah, Gerald left in October of 1992, and Angela Brasso was murdered in November of 1992. So it was the next month. Now, there's another murder that took place that police believe Bryan Miller is responsible for, Brandy Myers, that took place in May of that year. So when I was talking to Gerald, I said, he's accused of this other murder. They're not taking him to trial. And I don't know if that affects Gerald's guilt, feeling of guilt, like he could have prevented, because police do believe that Bryan Miller killed Brandy Myers, and that started while Gerald was there. But it sort of adds to this dismay that Gerald felt. Like, he really felt like he was having an impact on this kid, like he was helping Bryan Miller become a functional person. And then to find out that he may have committed these murders and that this other person was there too, the other person meaning this other personality that Bryan Miller had. 20 plus years later, Gerald Schrock still is wrapping his head around that. And I think, to give you an idea of how he feels, we'll play a couple of clips here, a couple of my questions and his answers. And I think they do a good job of establishing how this guy feels today.
When you heard that he was arrested and what he was arrested for, how did that hit you?
Didn't seem possible. My first thought was no. I mean, you're questioning suspects. I understand that, but that's the wrong guy. I didn't think it was possible.
The defense says that he's mentally ill and that he did not know what he was doing and was incapable of understanding right from wrong back then. Do you buy that?
No, I don't.
Did he seem like he knew what was right and what was wrong back then?
Yes, he did. Part of me is angry. If this is true, I'm angry because he knew better. Mm-hmm. That's my rationale, and I feel like I've been suckered, or he had chances to change his ways. 'Cause I just really don't understand how you get from what I thought I knew to what I think I see. I don't buy the insanity plea. Of course, I don't know what insane looks like, but I don't think it looks like that.
So you can tell from the tone of his voice that Gerald Schrock is a very introspective person, and he still can't really wrap his head around what happened, why it happened, but also he has a couple of opinions there about the insanity defense. And he is not, a psychologist, he's not a psychiatrist, a mental clinical expert, but he does not believe that Bryan Miller was insane back then. He thinks Miller knew right from wrong.
So that's interesting, though, because he was testifying for the defense. So, I mean, if he doesn't think that Bryan Miller was insane at the time, doesn't that go completely against everything the defense is trying to prove right now?
Well, he's not a psychologist, but this was in my conversation with him. Oh. He did not testify to that on the stand.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think, what his job was, what I suspect his job was in the eyes of the defense, was to establish Bryan Miller as a person, as somebody who was troubled back then, and to frame him in a more sympathetic light. And that's probably it, because they don't ask these untrained people in this trial, do you think he was insane? Because they don't have the training to pass that judgment. But we're not in trial right now. We're
on a podcast.
Right, and we do ask those questions because I think there is value in asking somebody who knew him back then that question.
100%.
It may not be a legal definition, but it is certainly interesting. And you brought up another point about Gerald Schrock when we were talking earlier about his role in Miller's life.
I mean, I think it played a bigger role than even maybe was brought up in the trial. Bryan lost his father really young when they were living in Hawaii. And it seemed, at least from what we've read in police records and documents, that Bryan and his father had a good relationship before he passed away. And so this seems to be the first person, like a male role model, a male figure guiding Bryan in his life for the first time since Bryan's dad passed away. And so I can imagine for Gerald, that bears some sort of weight knowing that, man, Bryan struggled. He obviously was in juvenile detention. He was accused of stabbing Celeste at the Paradise Valley Mall. And here, for the first time in years, Gerald is somebody that might be able to help shape Bryan, somebody who doesn't have a dad.
Yeah, a real mentor.
Right.
And that's how, we brought it up when we spoke to him, and I think Gerald agreed with that description. He was a mentor to him, and now he doesn't know what to make of all the time that he spent with him.
I mean, you have to feel for Gerald, because whether his influence, if he was here or not, played a part, to feel that guilt, even if it's not true, to live with that, I mean, this is decades now. And the fact that he was still almost processing it in real time as you were talking to him, that's heavy.
Yeah. We went around Phoenix to a couple of the places that he spent time with Bryan and spoke to him at a couple of different locations. And you could see he was sort of reliving the past in his mind. And then during our conversation, all of that came up. One, in my book, probably so far the most interesting witness that's been on the stand. But there was another interesting witness who testified in December.
Right. So we had been talking on these updates a lot about, will Bryan Patrick Miller's ex-wife Amy testify? She has not testified. However, one of Bryan's former girlfriends has testified, Serafina Nickel. And we knew who Serafina was before this, just through our research and everything we've learned about the case and about Miller. But she dated Miller for about 2.5 years, starting in 2006. So that was after Bryan was married to Amy. And Serafina and Bryan met at the Arizona Renaissance Fair. And we've talked a lot about that he was part of that kind of group, that fantastical group that would go to these things. So it makes sense that he would meet somebody, maybe like-minded, at something like that. And so he had his daughter already with Amy. So Serafina kind of got to see what Bryan was like as a father. Now, when she testified in court, Morgan and I were not in the courtroom that day, so we are pulling some information in the quotes that Serafina did say from an Arizona Republic article that reporter Lane Sainty wrote, who was in the courtroom. So Serafina said that Miller was what she called an emotionally stunted person who sometimes would punch walls during arguments, but she made it a point to say he was never violent toward her. And one of the quotes that was included in this article I found very interesting. She said, quote, "I was scared for Bryan, but I was not scared of Bryan. I was scared he would hurt himself, but I was never scared he would hurt me." So she kind of saw him as this damaged person who struggled to even express his emotions, but never as some sort of threat. And so clearly in the courtroom, she's trying to establish the fact that she had an intimate relationship with Bryan Patrick Miller in that time frame, which was a fair amount of time, 2.5 years. She did not witness any sort of violent tendencies that would, obviously go to the crime itself. She also said that Miller proposed to her after 2 months of dating. She said no, but they continued dating, and she mentioned that he was upset with the fact that he was more invested in the relationship than her. And she made it a point to say he'd get kind of shaken up at the smallest inconveniences, or even maybe small misunderstandings, would even cry about it at times, where it felt like that just wasn't rational for the situation, but that he almost couldn't get past this emotional wall he had up, was emotional about it, but could not maybe properly express his emotions, at least in the relationship with her. And something that's come up a lot in this trial that we've heard is that Bryan Patrick Miller did not like knives. He said they almost scared him. They triggered him to think about abuse from his mother and a traumatic childhood. So Serafina touched on this in the courtroom. This is not the first time we had heard this. She said she knew about his uncomfortability around knives, and that it was linked back to issues with his mom. And that is an interesting part of this whole thing, because we have heard about the knives throughout this trial. Obviously, whoever killed Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness used a very sharp knife that was a brutal stabbing. So the defense is trying to show somebody who was scared of knives and had this uncomfortable relationship with them could never be able to do something like that in a sane fashion. But what's also kind of note here is we learned that Amy, his ex-wife, and Bryan would use knives in a sexual way through their sexual activities, like a BDSM type role play to, I don't know, spice things up, to keep it interesting. Like, they liked that aspect of it. And that also kind of goes against the fact that if you're afraid of knives, why would you be using them in that way? Serafina said that nothing like that happened during her relationship with Bryan Patrick Miller. And she also went on to say that she never saw him be violent or have any violent tendencies toward his daughter, that he loved his daughter, but did say that she questioned his ability to parent because she felt it was limited due to all his emotional struggles.
Wow, there was a lot.
I know.
A lot to unload there. You know, the thing about knives, let's start there.
Yeah.
Because there are multiple victims. There are 2 who he's charged with, but there are other victims that investigators believe he attacked. And in every attack, it was a knife.
Every single one.
It is the weapon of choice. And so for the defense to bring someone in who says he was scared of knives, he didn't like to deal with knives. In addition, that reminded me of the conversation with Gerald Schrock, where we asked if he ever talked to Bryan about the attack that he went to juvenile detention for. And he would sort of shut down and say he didn't want to talk about it. And it was sort of like this side of Bryan that may appear to be somewhat normal, doesn't want to acknowledge or is scared of that other side. I mean, I'm not trying to do any kind of, psychological labeling here, but that's sort of what we see. And I'm assuming that the defense is trying to paint that picture because they're going to have some psychological expert testify that that's for a reason. And people like him are like this. They have that sort of phobia of the weapon. It's just fascinating, listening to you describe that testimony.
And that was somebody who was so close to him too, intimately. I kept reading over and over. He had his guard up. He would struggle to express words in a way that would be maybe normal for you and I. And I think that kind of goes to what you were saying. It almost feels as though the bad, he couldn't talk about it. It's like he could never get deep enough to get to that point to ever express that. Almost like he wanted to express something and just didn't know how. But it feels like it's a completely different person on that side of things, maybe, than the person that they were seeing. Maybe he's afraid of knives here, but is that what he was using on the other side? And did that maybe even play into a fear, not convicting him? If the defense is even saying he did this, but that he's insane, then he used knives.
Right. There was one other aspect to her testimony. Again, Briana and I were not in the courtroom then, but one of the producers that I was talking to, who we work with on this, was in the courtroom. And she said that Bryan Miller and Serafina only had one sexual encounter over the time that they dated, which I think was over a year, 2 years maybe.
Yeah.
It was a lot of time. He proposed to her. One sexual encounter that she was uncomfortable with because of the manner, the aggressiveness, the way that he was. And then they continued to be together afterwards. So we're not looking at what would be considered a normal relationship between these two. I am assuming that the defense knew about this and that they are going to use this somehow to show that he has these problems. But it also, throws out there, again, a sexual relationship with a woman, and he didn't do it right. He couldn't handle it. There was something there.
But does that mean he's insane? I mean, that's right. Ultimately, the defense is coming back to, was he insane at the time of the crimes? Does having a non-sexual relationship mean insanity.
Yeah. And so what the defense is doing is they're introducing characters like Serafina, like Gerald, and then they are introducing testimony from clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, people who have studied this type of behavior, people who have interviewed Bryan Miller, and they are sort of testifying to the judge about what this means. And there has been a lot of this very in the weeds psychological testimony that it's so in depth that it's not going to make it into a TV news story.
It's dry.
Right. It's dry. And the defense is arguing that it means this, and the prosecution is objecting over that. And it's almost impossible to sort of describe, what happened on that day when this psychologist or this clinician testified. But at the end of the day, the defense psychological team is trying to argue that Miller had a complex dissociative disorder and is and has autism spectrum disorder, and that meant that he was not responsible for what he might have done. And they're testifying that part of that was due to his really bad relationship with his allegedly abusive mother. And so a lot of that testimony so far has gone into showing that. And we're thinking that that is going to continue through January as at least 2 other psychological types. I'm calling them psychological types because I don't know what their titles are. There's going to be 2 more of them testifying in this next month. But let's get back to that point about Miller's relationship with his mom, because a lot of this is blaming this bad, abusive mother for how he ended up. Some of the testimony was that she made him watch these movies, Faces of Death and Shocking Asia, when he was young. And these are sort of odd, fringe documentaries about death and sexual perversion. And they're arguing that had such a big impact on him. It was part of that key that turned him into what he became. And they keep talking about this abusive relationship. However, in the 1990s, when Miller left Phoenix after those murders, he moved to Everett, Washington, where his mother was living. He followed her there.
And he was an adult by that point.
Yeah.
So he willingly made that choice to go. So it does beg the question, how abusive and how damaged was that relationship with his mom if he's going to live near her?
That's obviously what the prosecution is going to go into, but we went to Everett, Washington in 2021 following Miller, following his footsteps up there, and I marched up to the home that his mother and stepfather lived at, and the stepfather was there. His name was James Flores. And we talked about Bryan Miller and the Miller that he knew and the relationship with the mother. And Flores said that Miller was a completely unremarkable young adult and that there was nothing that stood out in particular about him or about his relationship with his mother at the time. Now, I think that James Flores is one of the witnesses that the defense wanted to bring in to testify, but he hasn't testified yet. I don't know what he would say to them that would be different from what he said to me, but you have to think that when the prosecution takes over again and has rebuttal witnesses, that they're going to be hammering the defense on this idea that if the mom was so bad, why did he follow her up there? I'm sure the defense will have an answer, but that is a valid question.
And so you say rebuttal witnesses. We still have a long way to go on this trial, which is crazy. This began in October.
Yeah.
I mean, and here we are in January giving the update. So just want to get everybody kind of caught up on what we expect to happen next and who we expect to testify. So we know, and you mentioned it, more psychologists, mental health experts will take the stand for the defense. And that'll be a very clinical, I don't want to use the word boring because it's very important to the trial, but to you and I, to listeners, it's going to be,
Yeah.
not overly exciting testimony, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, rebuttal witnesses. So what exactly does a rebuttal witness mean? The defense finishes. Do they
Yeah.
give their closing remarks? I mean, where does that come into play?
So the prosecution made their case in the beginning of the trial. These women died. He was the killer. The defense comes in with their testimony and their witnesses. And during that defense testimony, the prosecution is taking notes and saying, well, they admitted this, or they said that the wife said that, or they said that he lived there. And so now, after the defense is done making their case, the prosecution is going to be able to come back with rebuttal witnesses to say, okay, the defense said this, but this witness is here to contradict that. And this witness was there, and this witness knows. And we could have more than a dozen of these rebuttal witnesses. This is where I think we don't have a list of the witnesses. We have an old witness list. We don't have a new witness list. But this is where I think we're going to get some potential other family members. This is where I think we may hear from Amy Loving, which is Bryan Miller's ex-wife, the wife that he supposedly admitted to other attacks, another murder to. So that is going to be a day of testimony that we definitely want to listen to and will definitely bring to our audiences. But there will be, more than a dozen of these rebuttal witnesses. Then closing arguments, and the judge will then decide, is it not guilty by reason of insanity or guilty? If it's not guilty by reason of insanity, then it's, okay, you're going to a mental hospital and there'll be some parameters. If it is guilty, then it will go into the penalty phase. And that's going to be, is it the death penalty, or is it life in prison, or is it 20 to life? And that's going to be another mini trial where you have witnesses who come in that mitigate and aggravate, and statements from victim family members. And so we are looking at least through February. This trial could go even longer.
Yeah. And one thing that you just mentioned, I want to circle back real quick to Amy, because we know from Phoenix police that Amy is the one that allegedly was told by Bryan that he killed Brandy Myers, 11-year-old, in his neighborhood who was gathering money for a book-a-thon. Can that be brought up in this at all?
They would have to tie it back to something that a defense witness said. So there will be some things that are off limits that they can talk about. I think what is more likely is that some of these other incidents that he's accused of may come forward in the penalty phase.
Got it.
But these are technical rules that are used here, and I've made predictions about what's going to happen in this trial, and I've been wrong on some of them, right on a couple of others. So I don't think that they can bring that up during the trial, maybe during the penalty phase. But if the defense opened the door during some of the testimony to this, then that would be the mechanism by which the prosecutors could say, well, she says there's this other case and this other case.
So as of now, we have not heard any testimony related to Brandy Myers. So,
No.
Right. So at the moment, there's nothing to connect that to.
Right.
Okay. So that's interesting. And the other thing I want to note too, we have no idea how long the judge is going to take to come to a verdict.
Right.
I mean, we quite literally don't know if it's going to be, that day, the end of the closing arguments, she makes a decision. It's been months and months of testimony. Is she going to take weeks and weeks to review everything in the case and come to a conclusion? Is she just relying on her expertise and what she's gathered and surmised over the course of this trial to make a decision pretty quickly? we don't know.
Right. Here's what we do know. It's not going to be one of those situations where they finish their closing arguments and then everybody waits at the courthouse for the jury to make up the jury's mind, because jurors have the rest of their lives to live and need to come up with the verdict or the punishment, like that. So it's not going to be a situation where everybody's waiting at the courthouse. But like you said, does that mean it's going to be a day, a week, or a month? We don't know.
So there's a lot of waiting in this. So as it goes for the True Crime Arizona podcast, just like Morgan said, when there's a major update, if Amy testifies, things like that, we will bring you the very latest. But because this is going to go on for so long, we're going to begin another season on the True Crime Arizona podcast called The Last Hitman, that revolves around a really big case from 1980 and one final person, a convicted killer who recently just faced death. So that's going to be coming up on the podcast as we wait for the zombie hunter trial, the Bryan Patrick Miller trial, to play itself out. And then we will come back to you guys with the updates. And the reason I say that is because I've gotten quite a few texts, messages, emails from people, viewers, fans, people I know who listen to this podcast asking, hey, when's the update on Zombie Hunter? What's happening with that? Because it's been stop and go, that's why we're at where we're at right now. So we will keep everybody updated, but stay tuned. There's a really exciting season that we're going to be dropping here at the end of January into February, and then we're going to pick back up as we learn more in this trial. And Morgan and I will be here to bring you all the latest. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Briana Whitney.
And me, Morgan Loew. It is a production of 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.